On December 25, 1991, the red banner of the Soviet Union was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time. To most of the planet, it appeared to be a simple political breakdown. Many believed it symbolized democracy triumphing or the collapse of communism. But if someone had examined the financial records sitting inside the Ministry of Finance, they would have witnessed a very different narrative. The Soviet Union didn't fall because of ideology. It didn't collapse due to a revolution. It collapsed because it ran out of money. What ended that superpower was not an army, not a rebellion, but bankruptcy. This is the account of the largest financial failure human civilization has ever seen, the demise of a nation that controlled more than 40,000 nuclear weapons but could no longer afford basic food for its citizens. It is a warning about what occurs when a country becomes dependent on a single revenue stream and what happens when that source is suddenly taken away. To understand how a giant nation becomes financially ruined, we must travel back to the moment when it first believed it was wealthy. The year was 1965. In the icy wilderness of western Siberia, Soviet geologists made a discovery that would reshape the direction of the late 20th century. They uncovered oil, specifically the Samatler field. It wasn't just a regular oil deposit, it was an ocean of crude. At that time, it felt like a miracle. The Soviet economy had already begun slowing. The communist system was struggling to produce consumer products the population wanted. But suddenly, they didn't need to build excellent cars or impressive televisions anymore. All they needed to do was drill into the ground. Throughout the 1970s, global oil prices surged dramatically. The OPEC embargo against Western nations caused prices to shoot upward, and the Soviet Union became the greatest winner of that shock. Billions of dollars in hard currency poured into Moscow. It was like the state had won the largest lottery jackpot in its history. Yet this fortune turned out to be poisonous. The easy profits hid the underlying decay. Because oil revenue required almost no effort, the Soviet leadership stopped trying to fix their failing economy. Why rebuild malfunctioning factories when oil sales could pay the bills? Why attempt to repair agricultural shortages when oil exports covered the cost of imported food? The Soviet Union transformed into a petrostate, a developing world economy disguised by First World weaponry. They stopped manufacturing products that international markets wanted. They exported raw materials and depended on foreign nations for nearly everything else. They were trading the Earth's crude for food, machinery, and political loyalty. The Kremlin used the oil boom to purchase social stability. They kept food cheap with heavy subsidies. They financed low-cost housing. They funded their Eastern European satellite states. They expanded an enormous military machine that consumed a fifth of the country's total economic output. It looked like a golden era, but it was constructed on a fragile base. The entire stability of the Soviet system depended on a single figure, the global price of a barrel of oil. As long as oil stayed above $30 per barrel, the USSR seemed powerful, fearless, unstoppable. They could invade Afghanistan. They could intimidate Europe. They could try to match the United States in space. But in the early 1980s, the numbers began shifting. Both the United States and Saudi Arabia had been observing closely. They realized that the Soviet superpower was actually dependent, addicted to high oil prices. And soon, the commodity markets started turning against Moscow. Demand for oil began falling as Western nations improved their energy efficiency. At the same time, fresh sources of oil were entering global markets from the North Sea and from Alaska. Prices started trembling. And then the Soviet agricultural sector collapsed, a part of the story often ignored. Despite possessing some of the most fertile soil on the planet in Ukraine, the Soviet Union could not feed itself. The collective farm system was so dysfunctional that enormous quantities of food spoiled before ever reaching consumers. The supposed superpower was forced to import grain, millions of tons of it, and their primary supplier was their geopolitical rival, the United States. By the early 1980s, almost half of the USSR's hard currency earnings were spent just on buying grain to prevent starvation. They were selling oil to Western nations in order to purchase wheat from those same Western nations, a humiliating loop of dependency. But the Soviet leadership didn't panic. They studied the oil revenue charts and assumed the money would continue to flow. They believed the good times would never end. They did not realize they were stepping closer and closer to a financial cliff, and the edge was about to crumble beneath them. The countdown to disaster had already begun. The Soviet Union was heading straight into a perfect economic storm. The year was 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev entered the Kremlin as the new leader. He was young, full of energy, and fully aware that the system had become stagnant. Yet even he didn't grasp how dangerously close the country was to total collapse. He believed the Soviet Union had a minor illness. In reality, it was suffering from a fatal disease. Gorbachev announced an ambitious program called perestroika, meaning restructuring. He intended to modernize the economy, upgrade machinery, revive industry, and make Soviet production competitive with the rest of the world. But to launch these massive reforms, he required money, enormous amounts of it. He looked at the national budget and assumed the steady river of oil revenue would fund his plans. He was disastrously wrong. On September 13, 1985, Saudi oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani made a decision that would change the fate of the USSR. He declared that Saudi Arabia was done restraining its oil production to keep prices high. They were going to increase output dramatically. Saudi wells began pumping at full throttle. The global oil market was flooded. What followed was economic carnage. In 1980, oil had been selling at around $35 a barrel. By 1986, the price had plunged to roughly $10. For the Soviet Union, this price crash was nothing short of a death blow. Overnight, the country lost over half of its income. Imagine suddenly losing more than half of your paycheck while all your bills, rent, food, loans, remain exactly the same. That was the Soviet budget. It had been calculated assuming expensive oil. When prices collapsed, a huge crater formed in the national finances. Tens of billions of dollars vanished instantly. This catastrophe struck at the worst possible time. The Soviet Union was bogged down in a grinding, expensive war in Afghanistan. It was funneling massive sums to support communist regimes in Cuba, Vietnam, and Angola. It was trying to match the United States' costly strategic defense initiative, popularly called Star Wars. And despite all this, it still needed to buy grain. Ships loaded with wheat arrived at Soviet ports week after week, demanding payment in hard currency, dollars or gold. Rubles were useless abroad. They couldn't buy Western food or Western machines. Only real money mattered. Gorbachev now faced an impossible decision. He could slash military spending, risking the fury of the generals. He could cut food subsidies, risking riots among the population. Or he could borrow. He chose to borrow. The Soviet Union began taking out enormous loans from Western financial institutions, German banks, French banks, British banks. These lenders were eager and confident. After all, how could a superpower fail to repay? The USSR seemed like a stable borrower with massive gold reserves and decades of political continuity. So credit flowed freely. But these weren't development loans. This wasn't capital being used to build profitable industries. These were survival loans. The Soviet state was borrowing simply to buy food and basic goods so that store shelves wouldn't look completely empty. They were using foreign credit to keep daily life from falling apart. It was a credit card spiral on a national scale, borrowing to eat. While this was happening, Gorbachev made a domestic policy mistake that pushed the economy even closer to the edge. He launched a massive campaign against alcoholism. Vodka, he believed, was destroying workers' health and productivity. So he restricted alcohol sales and destroyed vineyards. Morally, perhaps it made sense. Economically, it was disastrous. Alcohol taxes were one of the state's biggest revenue sources, second only to oil. When Gorbachev cut alcohol availability, he unknowingly eliminated another major chunk of the government budget. But the drinking didn't stop. People simply made alcohol at home. Moonshine production exploded. Sugar vanished from stores because citizens were buying it in huge quantities to ferment their own spirits. The state earned nothing. The people drank anyway. It was a complete fiscal loss. By 1988, the deficit was spiraling wildly. The government began doing the one thing a failing economy should never do. It started printing money. Rubles were created to pay workers' wages, but there were hardly any goods left to purchase. The extra money just piled up in households. Economists call this a monetary overhang, cash everywhere but nothing to buy. Shortages intensified. Lines for bread stretched for hours. People would join any queue they saw because whatever was being sold, shoes, sausage, or soap, would likely be gone by tomorrow. The unwritten social contract of the Soviet state was collapsing. Citizens had long tolerated the lack of political freedom because the government provided stability, cheap food, low rent, guaranteed jobs. Now stability was evaporating. The stores were empty. The ruble was losing value. And confidence in the system was collapsing along with it. By 1989, the Soviet economy wasn't merely slowing down, it was disintegrating. When the Berlin Wall fell and Eastern European communist governments collapsed, the world saw political liberation. But inside Soviet financial institutions, it looked like a fiscal disaster. For decades, the USSR had forced Eastern Europe to trade within a closed system using fixed exchange rates. Now those nations demanded to be paid in dollars, not worthless rubles. The economic network that had kept the Soviet system afloat for years suddenly imploded. Inside the Kremlin, panic spread quickly. Gold reserves that had once seemed endless were draining at an alarming pace. In the mid-1980s, the USSR possessed huge amounts of gold stored in secret vaults. By 1990, officials were secretly flying gold bars to London and Zurich, selling them urgently just to afford the next shipment of imported food. They had to sell so much gold, so fast, that the global market price dropped, meaning the more they sold, the less they earned. It was a financial tailspin. Then came what historians later called the War of Laws. This internal revolt struck at the heart of the Soviet system. Individual Soviet republics, Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and others, began refusing to send their tax revenue to the central government. Boris Yeltsin, the elected head of the Russian Republic, openly instructed tax authorities, "Keep the money here. Don't send it to Moscow." With that one command, the central budget evaporated. Gorbachev still held the title of President of the Soviet Union, but he had no functioning treasury. He controlled nuclear missiles, yet couldn't pay the salaries of the troops overseeing them. In 1990, something once unimaginable occurred. The Soviet Union began defaulting on commercial payments. Cargo ships carrying frozen meat, butter, and other essentials waited offshore near Leningrad, refusing to unload. Captains radioed port authorities to say they would not release the goods until the USSR's payments cleared. The problem was simple: the checks were bouncing. The government was out of hard currency. With no other choice, Soviet officials went to the West seeking basic humanitarian assistance. It was humiliating for a country that had defeated Nazi Germany and sent the first human into space. Yet now they were requesting emergency supplies, powdered milk, canned meat, baby food from Germany and other Western states. Then came one of the final blows. The Vneshekonombank, the Soviet institution responsible for foreign economic relations, abruptly froze every account it controlled. Companies that had earned hard currency through legal trade woke up to find their foreign currency balances emptied. The government had seized the funds to service its national debt. It was a massive act of financial confiscation. Whatever trust remained in the system evaporated overnight. The ruble essentially stopped functioning as real currency. The economy reverted to barter. Factories paid workers not in money, but in whatever goods they produced: tires, glassware, tools, textiles. Workers then stood along roadsides trying to trade items for food. A man might exchange a set of car tires for a sack of potatoes. Ordinary stores were irrelevant. The black market became the only market that actually worked. The US dollar became the real currency of survival. People who had access to Western cash, taxi drivers, waiters, prostitutes, suddenly earned more than doctors or engineers. Highly educated professionals lived in poverty while the informal economy flourished. In August 1991, communist hardliners staged a coup against Gorbachev. Tanks rolled into Red Square. The plotters wanted to restore the old order and reverse the reforms. But they forgot the most crucial point: economic collapse cannot be reversed with military force. Bullets cannot fix balance sheets. They had no plan to repair foreign debt, no plan to restock empty supermarkets, no plan to stabilize the currency. Their coup unraveled not only because citizens resisted, but because the conspirators soon realized they were fighting to seize power over a system that was already sinking. They were trying to captain a ship that had already submerged. When Gorbachev returned after the failed coup, his authority was hollow. The real political weight had shifted to Boris Yeltsin and the republics. But the Soviet Union's enormous debt still hung over everything like a storm cloud. Western lenders, the G7 nations, were alarmed. The USSR owed nearly $70 billion. If the Union dissolved, who would repay it? Would Ukraine take responsibility? Would Kazakhstan? Or Russia? The creditors demanded a legal guarantee, joint and several liability. They insisted that regardless of which republic survived, someone had to accept the debt. By the final months of 1991, the Soviet Union existed in name only. Government employees went unpaid in November, then December. The printing presses ran constantly, producing huge stacks of near-worthless banknotes. Hyperinflation had arrived. The end was imminent. In the end, the collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't a sudden thunderclap, but a long, slow unraveling, an empire drained by its own impossible promises. By the late 1980s, the Soviet leadership stood before a ledger that no longer balanced. Every factory that couldn't compete, every subsidy that kept failing industries alive, every ruble printed without value, all of it accumulated like a ticking clock counting down to an inevitable economic reckoning. While the world saw political reforms, glasnost speeches, and calls for openness, the true crisis was quietly unfolding in balance sheets and dwindling reserves. The state could no longer afford its global ambitions, nor the heavy machinery of control that kept its people compliant. Even its vast oil fields, once the lifeline of a superpower, couldn't cover the widening gap between what the USSR spent and what it earned. When the price of oil dipped and production faltered, the empire's last pillar cracked. By the time 1991 arrived, the Soviet Union was running on the fumes of a system that had already collapsed from within. The military still marched, the parades still ran through Red Square, and propaganda still boomed through evening broadcasts, but the economic foundation beneath it all had been quietly hollowed out. Superpowers rarely fall in a dramatic explosion. More often, they simply run out of the resources needed to sustain the illusion of strength. That is what happened here. The world's second-largest power simply ran out of money, and when the money disappears, power evaporates with it. In December, when the hammer and sickle flag was lowered for the final time, it was merely a ritual acknowledging what spreadsheets and shortages had already declared. The Soviet Union had bankrupted itself. And that is the real lesson buried beneath the political drama. Empires do not collapse because of ideology alone. They collapse because economies fail long before governments admit. The USSR did not lose to an enemy. It lost to arithmetic. Its downfall wasn't written on the battlefield. It was etched quietly in the declining numbers of oil output, in the soaring costs of subsidies, and in the empty shelves of ordinary citizens who paid the price for the grandeur of their leaders. When a nation's ambitions exceed its economic capacity, collapse becomes inevitable, no matter how powerful it appears from the outside. The Soviet Union, with all its nuclear weapons and vast territories, proved that even giants can crumble when their foundations rot from within. In the closing scene of the story, the most haunting thought is not how the USSR fell, but how long it kept standing despite its deep internal fractures. It endured on momentum, on appearance, and on the myth of unshakable strength. But numbers do not bow to myths. Economies do not obey ideology. And in the end, the Soviet Union discovered the same truth that has humbled every empire before it. No nation is too powerful to fail when it tries to defy economic reality.